I arrived on Frostgrave 9 aboard the strike cruiser Aegis Vigilant with the precision and detachment expected of the Deathwatch. The world below was a frozen ruin, a storm-racked wasteland of ice spires and jagged cliffs stretching beyond sensor range. Yet something impossible struck immediately. Despite atmospheric readings confirming temperatures below -90 degrees, thermal sensors reported a persistent, unnatural warmth emanating from deep beneath the ice. My pulse did not quicken. Professional detachment demands observation, but a seed of unease took root. The landing party disembarked through the airlock, greeted by a gale that cut through power armor like a blade. Visibility was near zero. Swirling snowstorms refracted the dim auroral light into impossible geometries. Servitors followed at calculated intervals, their optics scanning systematically. The comms link crackled with the familiar cadence of telemetry updates. Geomagnetic interference rising. Resonance readings unstable. Unidentified movement beneath the ice. Our first patrol proceeded toward the abandoned mining settlements identified in orbital scans. Huts and barracks lay frozen in mid-operation. Tools stood upright. Meals remained on tables. Machinery hummed weakly, as if aware we were intruding. No personnel were present. It was as though the workers had vanished, leaving only echoes of their labor. I logged the anomalies with meticulous detail, frost patterns forming over surfaces in symmetrical spirals, the occasional inexplicable shadow moving counter to wind direction. We discovered our first environmental hazard within an hour. A passage collapsed spontaneously, sending a wall of ice fragments in a silent avalanche. No sound preceded it. The physics of the collapse defied prediction. It was here that I first noted the helix markings, etched deeply into the ice, glowing faintly in pulsing rhythms. They were geometric, almost liturgical in design, repeated on multiple surfaces with variations too subtle to be accidental. Servitors attempted to scan them, but sensors fluctuated, readings inconsistent. It was as if the ice itself resisted comprehension. Comms logs recorded our tentative attempts to communicate. Patrol Delta to Captain, visual anomalies detected. Thermal readings spiking despite extreme cold. Recommend investigation. The reply was terse, ritualistic even. Proceed with caution. Document all deviations. The Emperor watches. I found comfort in protocol. Detachment is a shield against fear, yet nothing in my training prepared me for the way the landscape seemed aware. The storm intensified. Snow fell horizontally, then vertically, then twisted upon itself, forming spiraling columns that seemed to hover for a heartbeat before descending. The aurora flickered irregularly, casting shadows that did not correspond to any solid object. It was in this environment that a patrol discovered the first tangible clue of intelligence behind the anomaly. A hatch, previously sealed and appearing fused with ice, slid open on its own. From the dark, faint chanting echoed, toneless, fragmented, but unmistakably intentional. I ordered the patrol to hold formation. Instruments failed intermittently. Servitors shivered violently, as if sensing an invisible presence. I noted the psychological effects. Hesitation, compulsive scanning of the ice walls, murmured prayers that slipped from standard litanies into improvised supplications. Even the most disciplined Marines exhibited micro-hesitations. Hands lingering over bolter triggers, heads turning toward impossible angles. We documented every detail of the hatch and its surroundings. The helix markings pulsed in time with an unmeasured heartbeat, our own perhaps, or that of the anomaly below. I recorded the anomaly's first interaction with us, a soft vibration through the ice that propagated through boots and armor, resonating in the chest cavity like a war drum played from within the planet itself. The comms reported a spike in geomagnetic activity coinciding with the vibration, though the source remained unidentified. At dusk, if the term can be applied to a storm-shrouded world, our first team was sent to secure the hatch. I descended last, cataloguing every step, frost forming on visors in patterns that resembled human faces. Echoes of our own movements returned, delayed and distorted. Even the scent of ozone warped and mingled with the metallic tang of blood from some unseen source. The tunnel beyond the hatch stretched into darkness, walls carved with the same symbols, growing more intricate, more deliberate. I paused to record. The ice behaves as a living entity. It responds to proximity, to sound, perhaps to thought. The markings may represent a language or ritual, but comprehension exceeds current classification. Team cohesion remains intact, but mental strain is evident. Recommend additional documentation and cautious advance. Before we could proceed, the helix symbols pulsed more rapidly, an almost imperceptible shift in rhythm that triggered a micro cliffhanger. The ice beneath a squad member's boot cracked, revealing a small fissure filled with dark, viscous liquid. The Marine recoiled, but before I could assess the substance, the fissure sealed silently, leaving no trace of breach. The anomaly had announced its awareness, reacting directly to our presence, and the tunnel beckoned, unexplored and hostile. I ended the log. We are at the threshold. The unknown lies beneath. The Emperor's guidance will be required. Any further movement will be recorded in minute detail. The anomaly is aware. Frostgrave 9 is not merely a planet, it is a sentience waiting. The chapter closes with this unresolved tension. The hatch opens. A tunnel of impossible darkness lies ahead, and the anomaly, alive, intelligent, and already interacting, has made its first move against the Deathwatch. The audience is left with the first, horrifying realization. The rules of reality do not apply here. An entry has consequences beyond calculation. The tunnel beyond the hatch was a maw of darkness, the blackness almost liquid in its density. My eyes, augmented with auspex and low-light optics, penetrated only a few meters before being swallowed by shadow. The squad moved in formation, bolters raised, servo armors creaking under the strain of the cold that seemed to deepen as we descended. The chill was not ambient, it was deliberate, almost conscious, as if the ice exhaled cold in waves, testing our resilience. Even the servitors shivered, their heat cores working overtime. The first anomaly presented itself within minutes. A wall of ice bulged inward, subtly, as though breathing. I ordered a halt. Auspex scans returned nonsense. Solid ice, yet readings fluctuated between organic and mineral. Servitor sensors attempted structural analysis. The data was inconsistent, oscillating between stable and unstable in milliseconds. A faint hum vibrated through the armor, a resonance no instrument could fully measure. One Marine whispered a standard litany, and I noted that the words felt insufficient against the oppressive silence. As we progressed, signs of habitation emerged. Narrow side chambers, their floors patterned in concentric circles, debris frozen mid-motion. Tools hung suspended over workstations, mid-swing, and in one, a severed mechanical limb floated slightly above the ground, untouched by gravity. I recorded it clinically. Objects retain previous kinetic state without physical explanation. Probable warp interference. The anomaly was asserting its influence, reshaping physics around us. The helix motifs returned, carved deeper into tunnel walls. This time they intersected, forming a lattice that pulsed faintly in dim light. Servitors attempted translation. All failed. The symbols seemed adaptive, rearranging subtly each time they were observed. I hypothesized a quasi-sentience embedded in the ice itself, reacting to our presence. Comms relayed telemetry updates. Low-level psychic resonance detected. Environmental anomalies increasing. We were no longer observers. We were participants. A micro cliffhanger manifested when one Marine stepped forward, boots crunching on frost. For a heartbeat, he froze. His visor fogged with condensation, but beneath the mist, I saw his reflection. Distorted, stretched, his face elongated impossibly. Then he collapsed to his knees, convulsing, eyes rolling back. The servitors attempted retrieval, but the ice resisted. Fingers sank into the floor, as though it were semi-liquid, pulling him downward. His cry echoed, distorted, bouncing from wall to wall, then vanished entirely. Only a frost-patterned handprint remained. The remaining squad pressed on, driven by protocol and necessity, but the psychological toll was visible. Repetition of prayers, compulsive scanning, and whispered speculation about what lies beneath marked their descent. I documented all behaviors clinically, noting how the anomaly was shaping perception, instilling doubt, and subverting cohesion. Telemetry registered minor distortions in timekeeping, suggesting the anomaly's influence might extend to temporal perception itself. Side passages revealed more of the subterranean structure, chambers with walls that seemed alive, faintly pulsating, strange organic growths fused with mineral, like bone and ice coalescing under some impossible chemistry. Microorganisms, if they could be called that, glimmered faintly, undetectable by conventional auspex. They appeared aware, shifting as if tracking our movement. I made note. The anomaly's domain was expanding beyond a single focal point, seeding corruption along tunnels in unpredictable patterns. The sensory layering escalated. A faint metallic odor blended with ozone. Frost formed on visors in geometric patterns that mirrored the helix symbols. Ambient sound distorted. Footsteps returning delayed echoes. A slight heat gradient countered the extreme cold in one sector, unmeasurable by any instrument, yet perceptible against my flesh. The contradiction between cold and warmth, movement and stasis, reality and perception, instilled a subtle dread that burrowed into the mind. Our advance revealed a chamber larger than previous maps suggested. The ceiling arched impossibly high, vanishing into darkness, walls covered in intricate carvings, ritualistic, alien, but containing discernible geometric patterns. Faint chanting filled the space, an echo of liturgical tones layered over alien cadences. The team paused, scanning, but every attempt to communicate was fractured, words distorted in transmission, audio returning slightly delayed, overlapping with the chant. The anomaly was experimenting, probing, asserting control over both environment and perception. Telemetry registered fluctuating warp resonance. Psychic readings spiked, but no active psyker was present. I noted a hypothesis. The anomaly's sentience was non-localized, extending its influence across both space and cognition. Micro cliffhanger. A small fissure opened in the chamber floor spontaneously. From it, a black, viscous substance seeped upward, coiling like living tendrils. The team fired, bolter rounds impacting ineffectively. The substance recoiled, retreating into the fissure. The anomaly had learned, reacting dynamically to threat. I made the decision to send a recon team deeper, moving toward what appeared to be the central axis of the subterranean structure. Telemetry updates continued. Temperature anomalies rising, gravimetric inconsistencies detected, minor time distortions confirmed. Comms relayed fragmented messages. Structure, alive, responding. The squad's cohesion was fraying, each member affected differently by the anomaly's psychic distortions. Before advancing, I logged the chapter's final observation. The subterranean domain is semi-sentient, responding to our presence. It manipulates perception, temperature, and physical laws. Our objective is unclear. Reality here is inconsistent. Movement itself may invoke response. Proceed with caution. Frostgrave 9 is not merely a frozen planet. It is a sentience. Our investigation is underway. The first tangible contact with the anomaly occurs at the axis of the helix lattice. The chapter ends on a macro cliffhanger. The deeper tunnels await, a structure alive, responding, and watching, with the anomaly's influence already extending to the minds and senses of all present. The audience is left with the unsettling realization that the environment itself is an adversary, bending physics, perception, and possibly the morality of those within its reach. The hatch sealed behind us with a sound that was less mechanical than organic, as though the ice itself had exhaled. The air grew denser with each step downward, pressing against armor seals, turning the breath-recycled atmosphere into something cloying and oppressive. I logged the descent in precise intervals, but my chronometer faltered, its readings stuttering, seconds looping back upon themselves before snapping forward. Time was not reliable here. The squad advanced in staggered tactical formation, bolters raised, Auspex units calibrated to maximum sensitivity. Our boots crunched over frost, yet even that sound distorted, elongated, bent, replayed seconds later in whispers. The deeper we moved, the less the tunnels resembled anything naturally formed. Walls curved with impossible symmetry, angles folding back upon themselves, geometry inconsistent with human comprehension. The sensation was unmistakable. We were entering something that had been designed, not discovered. The ice walls grew strangely translucent. Shapes moved within, frozen silhouettes suspended in pale light. At first, we assumed these to be bodies of the lost miners entombed in the walls. But upon closer inspection, the figures shifted position when not observed directly. Helmets tilted, fingers twitched, jaws opened in silent screams. The servitors attempted scanning protocols, but data returned null, corrupted by static. One Marine muttered, "They're watching us." The litany in response, "The Emperor shields," felt hollow in the space where the walls breathed. At 30 meters down, gravity shifted. It was subtle at first, an extra weight pressing on the chest, the sensation of armor dragging at unfamiliar angles. Then, with no warning, gravity twisted sideways. One Marine stumbled, pulled toward the wall as though the tunnel had tilted. He steadied himself, mag-locking boots, but the implication was terrifying. Physics itself bent to the anomaly's will. My log entry recorded it clinically. Gravimetric inconsistency detected. Severity increasing with depth. But internally, unease gnawed. The Emperor's galaxy is brutal yet ordered. To see its laws unmade is to glimpse heresy incarnate. We reached a choke, point, a narrowing of the tunnel. The helix markings, first seen faintly above, now spiraled in thick lattices across every surface. They pulsed in cadence with a low-frequency hum felt more than heard, vibrating within the sternum, rattling teeth. Our psyker, brother Codicier Halix, collapsed here, his faceplate steaming as he screamed incoherently. Fragments of his words were captured in vox logs. Endless coil, uncoiling, we are written. The anomaly was not only in the walls, it was in the mind, inscribing itself into thought. I gave the order to continue. Protocol dictated progress, not retreat. The Deathwatch endures. Still, unease spread like frost through the ranks. Squad cohesion faltered subtly, eyes lingering too long on the moving silhouettes, fingers tightening on triggers without intent. I noted the progression clinically, but with recognition. This was not simple fear. This was infiltration. At the base of the choke point, the tunnel opened into a vast chamber. Its dimensions were unstable. Auspex read 90 meters across, yet visually it appeared endless, receding into black. The ice floor reflected faint auroral light, though no source was visible. In the center, a pillar of ice rose, covered in helix symbols that writhed like living script. The pillar's presence warped the chamber. Distances stretched and contracted. Sound carried unevenly. It was here the first disappearance occurred. Brother Caldus, positioned at my right flank, stepped forward to secure the perimeter. His boot touched the floor, and he was gone. No flare of light, no distortion. One instant he was present, the next he had been erased. Only a frost-smeared handprint remained on the pillar, impossibly high above where he could have reached. Vox chatter erupted. A servitor shrieked in Binharic before shutting down completely, systems fried by psychic feedback. The remaining Marines locked into defensive formation, bolters aimed at the walls, though no target presented itself. I forced calm into my tone, recording. Subject Caldus lost to anomaly. Cause unknown. Evidence suggests non-linear spatial displacement. Recommend heightened vigilance. Yet beneath that composure, I knew. The anomaly was sentient. It had taken him deliberately, leaving the handprint as proof, or perhaps mockery. Sensory distortion intensified. The air thickened with metallic tang. Every breath tasted of blood. Frost formed across armor joints in geometric spirals. The auroral glow pulsed in rhythm with heartbeats, syncopated, as though syncing with us. Telemetry updates faltered, collapsing into fragmented signals. Signal lost, time distortion confirmed, helix expanding, before cutting into static. The squad pressed deeper into the chamber, driven less by command than compulsion. The helix pillar seemed to draw us forward, its rhythm worming into thought, turning hesitation into inevitability. Our steps echoed in strange cadence, each footfall returning, delayed, multiplied, as if unseen things walked in parallel with us. Halix, the psyker, staggered upright. His voice, hollow, filtered through Vox. It knows you, Captain. It writes your path as it has written mine. Descent is not choice, it is function. His eyes, bloodshot, glowed faintly with unnatural luminescence. Before we could restrain him, he strode toward the pillar, arms outstretched. Bolter fire erupted. Brother Antus fired a controlled burst at Halix, rounds slamming into his pauldron. Halix did not fall. Instead, the rounds hung mid-air for a moment, suspended, then dissolved into glittering frost. Halix's laughter echoed, warped, overlapping itself a second after each syllable. He pressed his hand to the pillar. The helix symbols flared, and the chamber's hum deepened into a roar that rattled armor seals. I ended the log. The anomaly has revealed partial capacity for direct manipulation of matter and thought. Its sentience is confirmed. It has taken one of ours and corrupted another. We are within its body or its mind. Descent is no longer a mission. It is entrapment. The final image. Halix standing fused to the pillar, his body frozen into the spiraling lattice, eyes wide, mouth moving in silent chant. The squad aimed weapons, but I held the order. The chamber pulsed around us, walls breathing, shadows watching. Then the floor shifted beneath our boots, cracking open into a yawning abyss that swallowed sound and light alike. Cliffhanger. The floor collapses beneath the squad, dragging them deeper into the unknown, forcing us into the next descent, where survival itself becomes uncertain. The late summer air in New Mexico grew heavy with the scent of dust and sagebrush. The townsfolk had done what they believed was necessary, laying the Withers children to rest once more, their small coffins lowered into a new patch of earth on the edge of the settlement. But peace did not linger. Whispers began within days. The soil above the graves seemed to shift unnaturally, as though something pressed upward from beneath. At night, the families who lived closest to the burial site swore they heard the faint scrape of wood, or the muffled thud of something knocking from within the earth. The mothers of the town grew restless, clutching their children close as the rumours spread. Some spoke of restless spirits, souls denied entry into heaven, condemned to wander. Others muttered about curses carried by the Withers bloodline, a taint that could not be sealed away no matter how many times the coffins were lowered into fresh earth. When one morning the caretaker discovered that 2 of the small graves had collapsed inward, he fled screaming to the church. The wood of the coffins was splintered, as though broken from within. No bodies remained inside. Fear swept through the town like wildfire. Had animals dug into the graves? Or was it something worse, something unnatural? A search was mounted. By lantern light, men with rifles scoured the dry arroyos and mesquite thickets, calling out in dread-filled voices. Hours later, the missing bodies were discovered, only a few yards from the cemetery, lying in the open dirt as though deliberately placed there. Their faces, pale and waxen, bore no sign of decay. Some swore the smallest child's eyes had been open. The priest insisted they must be reburied again, properly, with rites more thorough and prayers spoken louder. But doubt gnawed at the people. Each reburial seemed only to deepen the horror, not dispel it. Still, under the pale glow of the moon, the children were laid into the earth for the second time. The shovels rang against stone as the graves were closed. Yet even as the last mound of soil was patted down, unease filled every heart. The town slept little that night, waiting for the scratching sounds to return. It was no longer a matter of tragedy. It was becoming a matter of survival. The second burial was meant to bring calm. The priest's words had been stern, his prayers louder, his crucifix lifted high, as though the force of his faith could anchor the souls of the children into the soil itself. For a moment, the town believed it might be enough. But silence soon became its own kind of terror. No one spoke of it aloud, but each family kept watch from their windows as the days passed. The air around the cemetery was thick with stillness, the kind that made even the wind hesitant to stir. Livestock grew uneasy when driven past the burial grounds, their eyes rolling, their bodies pulling against the reins. The silence was broken on the fifth night. A young girl, Sarah Jennings, was the first to see it. From her bedroom window, she swore she saw movement at the far edge of the graveyard. She later told her mother it was the smallest Withers child, standing motionless in the moonlight, his head tilted unnaturally to one side. His lips, she claimed, moved as though whispering words she could not hear. When her mother rushed to the window, the child was gone, the cemetery empty under the pale silver glow. By morning, Sarah's account had spread. Some dismissed it as a dream. Others, though, remembered the unearthed coffins and the open, glassy eyes of the corpses. Fear dug deeper into their bones. Later that same day, the town's carpenter, Elias Ward, made a grim discovery. He had been tasked with reinforcing the cemetery's fence, hoping to keep wild animals from disturbing the graves. While working, he uncovered something strange: deep, deliberate scratches carved into the inside of the coffin lid he had repaired only days earlier. Not the work of vermin, not the decay of time. These were claw marks, gouged by something with desperate strength, pressed outward as though the dead had struggled against the weight of earth. The townsfolk gathered once more. Faces pale, hands trembling, they argued through the night inside the church. Some demanded fire, that the bodies be burned, the ashes scattered, to ensure nothing unnatural could rise again. Others recoiled at the thought, fearful of condemning the children's souls by such an act. The priest held his ground. He forbade fire. To desecrate the dead, he warned, is to invite damnation upon us all. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the truth. Even he was shaken. In the end, a compromise was reached. The children would not be burned, but the graves would be watched. Each night, 2 men would take turns guarding the cemetery with lanterns and rifles. It was decided with grim finality, as though the town had admitted what none dared to say aloud, that the ground no longer held the Withers children. And so began the Vigil of the Dead. The first watch began under a swollen red moon. 2 men, Thomas Hale, a farmer, and Matthew Cray, a trapper, took their places at the edge of the Withers graves. They carried rifles across their knees and lanterns that swayed with the night wind, casting pale circles of light across the dirt. The town gathered briefly to see them off. No one said it aloud, but all knew the unspoken truth. The men were not guarding the graves from what might come in, but from what might try to come out. The hours dragged. Hale paced in slow, heavy steps, muttering scripture under his breath, while Cray sat against the fence, his eyes narrowed against the shadows. The wind picked up, whispering through the dry grass, and somewhere far in the darkness, a coyote howled. At midnight, the earth stirred. It began as the faintest shift, soil loosening at the corner of the youngest child's grave. Hale stopped pacing. Cray rose to his feet, lantern lifted. The 2 men stared at the ground, watching as the dirt trembled. Then, with sudden force, a crack split the soil, and a pale, thin hand broke through. Cray fired his rifle without hesitation. The blast shattered the silence, sending birds shrieking from the trees. The hand recoiled, clawing once at the earth before vanishing back into the grave. The soil collapsed inward, as though swallowing the evidence whole. Hale fell to his knees, clutching his rosary. Cray cursed under his breath and reloaded with shaking hands. The rest of the night passed without further disturbance, but neither man spoke another word. When the sun finally rose, they returned to the church, pale and hollow-eyed, swearing before the others what they had seen. The town erupted into panic. Some claimed it was madness brought on by fear. Others, however, believed. They pointed to the scratches Elias Ward had discovered in the coffin, to the girl who had seen the child whispering under the moon. Piece by piece, a grim picture formed, one too terrible to dismiss. The priest ordered another burial. This time, the coffins were dug deeper, stones placed atop them, heavy as tombs. He chanted prayers until his voice cracked, and still he did not stop, as though words alone could anchor restless souls. Yet when dusk fell and the men returned to take their watch, the fear was greater than before. For what could stone and soil hold if faith itself was failing? The night stretched long, filled with every creak, every sigh of the earth. No one spoke, but all who watched felt it, the certainty that the Withers children were not at rest and never would be. And in the far distance, carried faintly on the wind, came a sound like children laughing. The Withers plot had become a wound in the heart of the town. Each time the children were lowered into the soil, it was as though the community was burying its peace along with them. Yet peace never came. By the third burial, the cemetery looked less like hallowed ground and more like a scarred battlefield. Earth turned over again and again, coffins shifted and reset, stones dragged from the quarry to weigh the dead down. The gravediggers, once steady men with hands hardened by labour, now trembled when their shovels struck the dirt. They worked with heads lowered, as if ashamed to look one another in the eye. Reverend Cole stood at the head of the open graves, his cassock stained with dust, his voice hoarse from endless prayers. His sermons no longer rang with the confidence of a shepherd guiding his flock. Instead, they cracked with desperation, each verse sounding less like a blessing and more like a plea. "We commit these children to the earth once more," he said, his voice breaking on the word once, "and may God this time grant them rest." Some townsfolk did not attend the ceremony. Fear had turned to exhaustion, and exhaustion to anger. Whispers rose in the tavern and the trading post, that the Withers family had been cursed, that something foul had marked their bloodline before they ever set foot in New Mexico. Others blamed the Reverend, claiming his prayers were powerless, his rituals shallow. Still others said the truth aloud, that nothing natural was happening, and no human hands could end it. The burial itself was meticulous. The coffins were driven deeper into the earth, nearly twice the usual depth. Stones, some weighing hundreds of pounds, were lowered onto them, creating a crushing layer meant to seal what lay beneath. Lime was poured over the soil, burning white against the dark earth, a bitter smell filling the air. The townspeople hoped it might choke whatever restless force lingered within the graves. And yet, as the last shovelfuls of dirt fell, a cold wind swept through the cemetery. It was sudden, violent, tearing hats from heads and rattling the lantern poles. Several women screamed as the wind seemed to circle the Withers plot, lifting dust and dead leaves into a spiraling column. Children cried, clutching their mothers' skirts, and men crossed themselves despite their Protestant faith. The Reverend shouted above the gale, his words lost to the roar, but his expression was unmistakable. Terror. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the wind died. Silence fell heavy, broken only by the rasping breaths of the mourners. The coffins were buried, the stones laid, the lime spread. The graves looked finished, stronger, unyielding. But none left believing it was done. That night, the watch was doubled. 4 men sat in the cemetery, rifles loaded, lanterns burning low. They passed whiskey bottles between them to keep warm and stave off dread, though none admitted what they truly feared, that no matter how deep the graves, no matter how heavy the stones, the Wither's children would rise again. At midnight, the men heard it, not the scratching this time, nor the cracking of soil. It was softer, more deliberate, a tapping from beneath the earth, like knuckles against wood, once, twice, 3 times. Then silence. The men froze. One whispered, "Lord in heaven." Another raised his rifle as if to fire into the ground itself. Then came a second sound, not from beneath the dirt but from beyond the cemetery wall. A child's voice, faint and playful. "Come out, it's time to play." The voice belonged to no child in town. It was hollow, echoing strangely in the still air, as if carried on a breath of wind from nowhere. 2 men ran, dropping their rifles in the grass. The others stayed, paralyzed, their lanterns trembling in their hands. When morning came, they swore to the townsfolk that the voice had circled the cemetery all night, whispering in the dark. By dawn, another grave had collapsed inward, the earth sunken as if something below had stirred. The stones remained in place, but cracks had formed between them. Thin as veins, but undeniable. The Reverend ordered the ground consecrated with fire. He sprinkled oil across the dirt, and torches were set to it. Flames licked the soil, scorching it black, filling the air with the acrid stench of burning lime and charred earth. People gagged and coughed, but none dared object. When the fire burned out, the ground smouldered. Smoke coiled upward, refusing to dissipate, drifting through the cemetery like fingers seeking flesh. That night, the smoke returned. Witnesses said it seeped from the graves themselves, pale and curling, carrying with it the faint shapes of faces, children's faces, twisted in silent screams. Mothers pulled their children from their beds, pressing them close, covering their ears so they would not hear the whisper that threaded through the smoke. "We are still here." By the end of the week, the Wither's children had been buried 3 times. And yet, for all the fire, stone, and prayer, the town knew the truth. The dead were not resting. They were waiting. The Wither's children were buried again. This time, the townsfolk gathered in near silence, their faces drawn tight, their movements mechanical, as though they carried out some grim duty rather than an act of faith. The ground at the churchyard had been disturbed too many times, so they chose a new place, a stretch of barren land at the edge of town where even weeds refused to grow. The men dug deep, deeper than before. Some muttered that they should have burned the bodies, but the priest silenced them with a glare. To deny burial rites would mean abandoning their souls entirely, and even in their fear, the townsfolk clung desperately to ritual. The coffins were lowered, and this time heavy slabs of stone were dragged from the quarry to rest above each grave. It took the strength of horses and half the town to set them in place, until at last the ground lay sealed, as though nothing could disturb it. But the silence that followed was uneasy. Children were kept indoors, windows were bolted at dusk, and in every whispered conversation the same question returned: how many times would it take? That night, the watchers kept vigil once more. Lanterns lined the graves like sentinels, and rifles were loaded, ready. For hours, nothing stirred, only the distant cry of owls and the hiss of the wind through the dry grass. Some dared to believe that the stone had worked, that the restless souls had been trapped at last, until just before dawn. The sound came first, a slow, hollow tapping, like knuckles against wood. Then another, sharper, from beneath the earth. The watchers froze. The lantern flames shuddered, though the air was still. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it became a pounding, echoing through the soil, striking against stone. One of the men broke. He fled into the darkness, dropping his lantern behind him. The others remained, trembling, their eyes fixed on the graves. And then, with a sound like thunder, the stones shifted. Not much, no more than an inch, but enough to prove that what lay beneath still moved, still fought, still rose. The men did not approach. They stood frozen until the sun crept over the horizon, painting the world in pale light. Only then did the pounding cease. The graves were silent again, the stones unmoved, as if nothing had happened. When the townsfolk gathered at morning, the priest knelt by the graves, his hands trembling over his rosary. His face was ashen, his lips cracked. 13 times, he whispered, almost too quietly to hear. They will rise 13 times before they rest. No one asked how he knew. Perhaps it was prophecy, perhaps madness. But the words spread like fire through the town. 13 burials, 13 risings. A curse that would not be broken until the cycle was complete. And with each repetition, the fear grew deeper, heavier, until it pressed on every heart. For now, they knew they were not witnessing an accident of restless earth or trick of imagination. They were watching a covenant of blood, one that would not end until the last spade of dirt was turned for the 13th time. The town had grown quiet, but not from peace. It was the quiet of fear, settled like frost over every roof and porch, stiffening hands and silencing voices. No child wandered outside after dusk. Doors remained locked, and shutters rattled in the biting wind. Even the cattle seemed to avoid the edges of the fire. Withers's plots, grazing farther from the cursed soil than reason would dictate. The third burial had failed to bring rest. The priest's prayers had been louder, more desperate. The earth itself hammered flat with stones and lime. But each night, the ground whispered. Not audible in the ordinary sense, but something deep, lodged within the marrow, that pressed against the skull with the weight of unseen fingers. On the 4th night, Jonathan Harper, one of the watchers, began hearing them clearly. He had gone to the graves alone, carrying lantern and rifle, attempting to convince himself that his mind was his own. And yet the whispers persisted, shaping words he did not speak. Do you see? Do you hear? We are here. Always. He froze, lantern light flickering across the icy soil, and saw them, or something like them, shadows shifting beneath the frost. Tiny hands broke the earth's surface for a heartbeat before recoiling, faces pale and impossibly small, peering through the ice and soil, staring up at him with empty eyes. Jonathan's rifle did nothing. When he pulled the trigger, the report echoed strangely, elongated and warped, bouncing across the horizon in uneven pulses, while the small faces blinked out of existence as if they had never been there. He dropped the weapon, knelt, and prayed until the frost numbed his fingers. By morning, he was found muttering, "They speak. They remember. We cannot leave them. Not yet." His words were incoherent to others, but the tremor in his voice confirmed what the town already feared. The Withers children had become a presence, not merely bodies. They haunted the soil, the air, the very night itself. That same day, the Reverend walked the cemetery, rosary tight in his hands. He spoke over each grave in harsh whispers, attempting to contain the unrest, to force order onto chaos. But as he chanted, a sudden shift of wind moved through the plots, carrying a faint giggle that made his hands shake. A candle at the edge of the graves flickered violently, then went out. The priest left, hurriedly, mumbling of unholy things that should not be summoned by prayer alone. By the 5th night, small lights appeared in the graveyard. Lanterns, yes, but not the ones carried by humans. Tiny glimmers moved between the graves, darting quickly, avoiding detection if one tried to focus. The watchers reported them as fireflies at first, until one of the men, Henry Briggs, swore he saw the smallest child, her hand outstretched, as though calling him forward. He did not go. He could not. And yet, when dawn came, he had scratches along his forearms, thin lines bleeding faintly, as if he had brushed against unseen nails. No one else had touched him. The town debated abandoning the cemetery, but superstition and desperation collided. To leave the children unburied, some argued, would invite damnation. To dig them up again might provoke the spirits further. Yet every attempt at reason collided with the impossible. Each night, the soil moved, the whispers rose, and the presence of the dead became more tangible. That night, Reverend Cole ordered the Watchers to record everything. Every whisper, every light, every tremor of the soil. He demanded logbooks, sketches, and careful measurements. He believed documentation could anchor reality, could contain the horror in some methodical way. And so Jonathan Harper, Henry Briggs, and 2 others sat vigil, lanterns burning, pens in hand, hearts hammering with dread. Midnight passed with nothing, or so it seemed. Then, from the far edge of the cemetery, a shadow rose, tall, impossibly thin, elongated, walking upright as though it had grown from the frost itself. Its form was a distortion, shifting subtly with every blink of the Watchers' lanterns. It paused at the 4th grave, where the youngest of the Withers children had been buried, head cocked at an unnatural angle. A voice, soft but echoing, carried across the cemetery. "We are not done. We have never been done." The shadow dissolved as quickly as it had appeared, but the whispers escalated, threading through the very marrow, drilling into the mind, repeating in endless recursive loops. The Watchers could not look at one another. Eyes darted, hearts thumped. Fingers twitched involuntarily toward rifles that seemed useless in the face of what they were witnessing. By sunrise, the soil had shifted again. Small divots appeared along the grave edges, thin trails of frost marking where the children had pressed upward, just below the surface. The Watchers could not explain it. None would admit to seeing the tiny hands or faces in the daylight, yet the scratches and impressions confirmed the impossible. Something beneath the earth moved, something aware. Reverend Cole met with the townsfolk at dawn, his face pale and drawn. He said only this: "They are waiting, and each night they grow bolder. There is no mercy to be found here, only observation. We must endure, or else become part of their game." The chapter closes on a macro cliffhanger. The Watchers and townsfolk realize that with every night that passes, the Withers children grow stronger, more insistent, their presence bending reality itself, an impossible entity, neither alive nor dead, asserting dominion over the frost-laden earth. The 4th burial was not approached with hope. It was a ritual born from desperation, from the slow, grinding understanding that no ordinary act of faith could contain what lingered beneath the frost. The townsfolk had learned to move silently, their faces set in lines of grim resignation. Even the children stayed inside, locked behind doors, windows shuttered against the night. Reverend Cole insisted on performing the rites himself, and the town obeyed without question. The coffins were exhumed carefully, placed on sleds, and dragged to a newly prepared site, further from the old cemetery into the sparse brush beyond the ridge where no wind dared linger. Each step was deliberate, the earth cold and unyielding beneath the sleds, the frost cracking sharply like bone. Cole's chants were long, twisting, ancient words that he claimed were older than the town itself, older than the Withers family's bloodline. He circled the graves thrice, sprinkling salt and lime, drawing protective glyphs in the soil, and marking boundaries with iron stakes hammered deep into the frozen earth. "By the mercy of God and the sanctity of the grave, may your restless spirits find final rest," he intoned, voice strained but unyielding. "May the earth receive you and the stones guard you. Amen." The graves were dug twice as deep as before, each coffin buried beneath 6 feet of frozen soil, capped with slabs of granite quarried from the mountainside. Torches were set around the perimeter, forming a circle of light meant to ward off the unnatural. Yet even as the last spade of dirt was replaced, a subtle tremor ran through the ground. Not violent, not immediately perceptible, but it was enough to send a shiver up the spine of every watcher. The frost of the evening seemed to lean closer, brushing the hair of those nearby with invisible fingers. The night watchers were selected with care. The town appointed 4 men to take turns, rotating shifts across the long night. Among them was Jonathan Harper, still shaken from previous vigils, and Henry Briggs, whose arms bore the thin, bleeding scratches from the last encounter. The other 2 men, local farmers unaccustomed to fear of the unnatural, gripped their lanterns with white knuckles, eyes wide and unblinking. At first, the night was quiet. The wind held its breath. The torches flickered but burned steadily. Even the animals in the distance remained silent. The watchers began to allow themselves a tentative relief, though the weight of dread lingered in every muscle. A tension coiled tightly, like a spring ready to snap. It was close to midnight when the first anomaly occurred. A faint glow appeared at the edge of the burial site, dim at first, then pulsing with a rhythm that seemed almost organic, almost alive. Jonathan Harper's lantern caught the reflections, and he froze, breath caught in his chest. The glow took shape, faint and translucent, the outline of a small child, moving with deliberate precision across the frozen ground. The watchers fired. Rifles discharged into the air, into the dirt, but the figure did not falter. Each round seemed to dissolve into mist before reaching it. The child, or whatever it was, paused at the corner of the 4th grave. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and though it emitted no sound, a voice echoed through the watchers' minds. "You cannot bury what remembers you." Jonathan dropped to his knees, hands over his ears, as the voice penetrated his skull directly, reverberating with a resonance that made his teeth ache. Henry Briggs stumbled back, tripping over a frozen root, and the 2 farmers froze, eyes wide with terror. The small figure began to multiply, or the watcher's perception betrayed them, until shadows of children moved across the frost, spinning and weaving, some fading, some solid, all watching, all patient. Then came the shaking. The frozen earth convulsed, thin cracks spiderwebbing across the graves. A slab of granite shifted, sliding a half-inch, revealing a glimpse of splintered coffin beneath. The watchers recoiled, screaming, though their cries were swallowed in the sudden gust of wind that rushed through the brush like a living thing. Reverend Cole arrived moments later, summoned by frantic calls. He carried holy water and a censer, swinging both with hands that trembled despite the ritual training he had practiced for decades. The incense smoke twisted unnaturally, curling against the wind, forming faint, almost recognizable shapes. Tiny faces, mouths moving in silent chant. By the saints, by the angels, by the mercy of the Almighty, be still. But the ritual did not calm them. The ground split further, frost giving way to black soil that writhed faintly, as if something beneath it could feel, could see, could will itself into motion. The watchers scrambled backward, some tripping into each other, and the torches flared, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move independently of their owners. The Reverend raised his voice, louder than any man could reasonably project, yet the whispers persisted, threading through the wind, slipping between words, burrowing into the minds of those nearby. By the first hour of dawn, the watchers were exhausted, pale, and trembling. The graves had shifted. The stones, previously placed with painstaking care, now tilted slightly, and small divots appeared across the frost, impressions of tiny hands pressing against the frozen soil. No matter how deep they were buried, no matter how much stone or lime or prayer was used, the children, or whatever they had become, had forced a mark upon the world above them. The Reverend sank to his knees in the frost, mumbling incomprehensible prayers. He lifted his head and gazed at the watchers. It is not enough. Not yet. They remember. They have never stopped remembering. And we are witnesses only. Our hands are too weak, our prayers too shallow. There is nothing we can do but endure. The watchers left as the sun rose. They returned home broken, their minds haunted by visions that would not fade. The translucent figures, the black soil writhing, the tiny hands pressing upward from the frost. That day, the town was silent. People moved quickly from door to door, avoiding the cemetery entirely, yet aware that every footstep might echo into the awareness of what slept beneath the graves. By nightfall, a faint wind carried the first whispers of the coming cycle, threading through homes and alleys, curling beneath doors. The Withers children had been buried 4 times now, and yet the town understood a simple, terrifying truth. The cycle would not end until every measure of stone, prayer, and frost had been exhausted, and even then, there might be no release. The chapter closes on a macro cliffhanger. As the Watchers return to the cemetery that night, the frost at the graves begins to move in patterns too regular, too deliberate, to be natural, as though the children are rehearsing their return, their presence bending reality itself. The land shivers, awaiting the 5th burial, and the sense of inevitability presses down on every soul in the town. The 5th burial had begun under the oppressive grey light of early evening. The town, hollowed by weeks of fear, gathered at the edge of the barren ridge. The ground, scarred from previous interments, seemed to pulse faintly beneath the spade. Each villager moved with mechanical precision, carrying stones, coffins, and holy symbols, a grim procession of exhausted souls who no longer spoke but only obeyed. Reverend Cole led the rites, his hands shaking despite decades of experience. His cassock was streaked with frost and mud, his breath clouding in the chill air, each word of prayer clipped and harsh. The earth, he intoned, would accept the children, yet the weight in his voice betrayed doubt. Around him, lanterns flickered, their flames bending against an invisible current, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The Watchers were ready. Jonathan Harper and Henry Briggs, returned from previous vigils, stood with rifles loaded, lanterns slung, eyes wide, hearts hammering. Beside them were 2 farmers, hollow-eyed and pale, each silently vowing to survive the night without succumbing to the whispers. As the coffins were lowered, the air shifted. The frost grew thick, coating the stones and grass in crystalline patterns sharp as glass. The ground trembled subtly, a pulse beneath the soles of their boots. A sound rose from the soil, a soft, wet scraping, as though something pressed against wood and stone from within the coffins themselves. Harper froze, recognizing the sound immediately. It was the same rasping clawing from nights past, but stronger, more deliberate, with rhythm and intelligence. Each tap, each scrape, seemed to echo through the marrow of his bones. Briggs whispered a prayer under his breath, but the words faltered as another sound joined the first. Faint, high-pitched laughter carried on the wind. Not human, not fully childlike, but somewhere between the two. And it passed through the Watchers' minds like a finger tracing the spine. The Reverend, undeterred, continued the rites. He sprinkled holy water, recited long, archaic passages, and swung his censer in wide arcs. The smoke curled unnaturally, forming faces that twisted and turned before vanishing into the night air. Harper thought he saw the smallest Withers child, translucent and thin, at the corner of the grave, staring at him with impossibly deep black eyes. The figure vanished when he blinked, leaving only frost-marked soil in its wake. A sudden gust of wind knocked over one of the lanterns. Briggs lunged to catch it, and in that instant, the earth convulsed violently. A coffin shifted, splitting the frozen soil, revealing a crack of darkness within. Something small and pale pushed against it. Hands, hair, tiny features, pressing upward, straining to escape. The Watchers recoiled, some screaming, some frozen in disbelief. "By God's mercy!" the Reverend shouted, slamming the censer to the ground. Smoke rose in thick coils, forming shapes that were vaguely humanoid, yet impossibly wrong. Elongated limbs, twisted faces, mouths moving soundlessly. The frost around the graves began to shatter, forming sharp shards that floated upward like spectral glass. A hush fell over the watchers, broken only by the whispered laughter from the soil, which now seemed to have multiplied, echoing from every direction. Harper realized with dawning horror that it was not laughter alone. It was chanting, faint and recursive, a rhythm in perfect sync with the pulsing earth. They remember all. You cannot bury what has learned to rise, Harper murmured, voice barely audible over the wind. The Reverend, undeterred, raised his arms, speaking prayers older than the town itself. The watchers followed his gestures hesitantly, forming a circle of faith around the graves. For a moment the wind stilled. The frost stopped its shifting. The shadows paused. And for the first time that night, the watchers allowed themselves a breath. But it was brief. The ground split along the lines of previous graves, stones rattling, soil heaving. From the frost-covered earth emerged forms, indistinct, half-shadowed, humanoid, each smaller than a child, yet twisted and disproportionate. They moved with a deliberate grace, their faces featureless but somehow expressive, pressing against each other, coalescing, whispering in unison, though their mouths never moved. One watcher screamed, another fainted. Harper's lantern trembled violently in his grip, threatening to fall into the teeth of the dark figures. The Reverend yelled, voice cracking, invoking saints, angels, and the Almighty, but even as he did so, a single pale hand broke from the frost. It reached toward him, long fingers curling, the skin impossibly smooth, yet disturbingly cold. "They are not bound by stone or prayer," the Reverend cried. "They are bound by memory, by fear, by the marrow of men." The watchers tried to repel the figures, shaking rifles, brandishing lanterns, but it was as if the earth itself conspired against them. The frost moved beneath their boots, following their steps, whispering in cadence with their heartbeat. Shapes pressed upward, then vanished, leaving only impressions in the soil. Every glance revealed a new figure, a new distortion of the children, some barely formed, some horrifyingly complete. By midnight, the ritual had failed to contain them. The frost thickened, curling upward, forming ephemeral walls between the watchers and the graves, trapping them in a corridor of crystalline fear. Laughter and whispers reverberated from every direction, echoing inside the skulls of the men, drilling into thought, memory, and instinct. The Reverend fell to his knees, exhausted beyond endurance, tears streaking his frost-bitten face. "Witness, only witness," he whispered, voice broken. "We can only bear it." And bear it they did. All night they remained, lanterns flickering, rifles useless, eyes straining against impossible figures that pressed, moved, and observed. The children, no, the entities, were alive in memory and matter both, shaping the frost, bending the earth, rewriting the laws of the cemetery itself. By dawn, Harper and Briggs were changed, pale, trembling, their eyes haunted. They had witnessed not only the impossible, but the persistent, intelligent presence of the Wither's children. The town could no longer deny the truth. Each burial increased the power of these entities, their will growing stronger, their patience deeper. The chapter closes with a macro cliffhanger. As the watchers stagger away from the graves, the frost begins to move independently, forming geometric patterns, circles, triangles, symbols reminiscent of rites long forgotten. From within the shapes, faint voices whisper, "We remember, and soon. All will remember with us." The fifth burial is complete. The terror has evolved. The Wither's children are no longer just spirits. They are a force, waiting to reshape reality itself. The sixth burial had become more than a ritual. It was an endurance test. The town itself moved as though under a spell, bodies hollowed by weeks of dread, faces pale and unrecognizable. Children had vanished indoors, doors bolted, windows shuttered, yet even within the homes, the whispers traveled. The Wither's children were no longer confined to soil. Their presence permeated the air, threading through the frost, settling into bones, twisting minds. Reverend Cole prepared the coffins with hands that trembled despite decades of sacred experience. He smeared protective oils over the wood, carved new glyphs of warding across the lids, and chanted prayers older than memory itself. The frost had become a living entity, thickening with each passing day, curling in unnatural spirals around the graves. It pressed against the watchers' boots and palms, carrying faint impressions of tiny hands that had broken through the soil before. The watchers were reinforced this night. Jonathan Harper and Henry Briggs returned, joined by two new men, local labourers, hardened by work, but untested against forces that defied comprehension. Lanterns were distributed, rifles primed, and each man carried a piece of iron or steel, though none truly believed it would matter. As the coffins were lowered, the wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of decay, despite the bodies being buried weeks before. The frost quivered, patterns shifting into geometric shapes, circles and lines perfectly etched, pulsing with an almost conscious rhythm. The watchers could feel it in their chests, a vibration, a resonance, a pressure building deep in their bones, synchronized with the heartbeat of the earth beneath them. At midnight, the anomaly began. The soil trembled first, slight at first, then violently. A coffin tilted, slamming against frozen stone. A low, wet groan emanated from the earth as though the bodies inside were aware, moving, fighting. The watchers fired into the frost, bullets dissolving into mist, hitting nothing, while shadows flickered at the edges of lantern light, flickering with grotesque fluidity. A single figure emerged from the frost, thin, translucent, impossibly pale. Its face, indistinct yet filled with intent, watched the watchers with black, unblinking eyes. A high-pitched voice echoed in their minds. "You bury us, and yet we return. We remember all. We are patient. You will tire, and then we will rise." The watchers dropped to their knees, guns useless, eyes wide with horror. The frost around the grave thickened, rising into sharp, crystalline shapes, each shard reflecting forms from the watchers' pasts, their fears, their failures, memories they had long buried. The land itself seemed alive, pressing against them, bending around the watchers as though the Wither's children had infused it with their will. Reverend Cole swung his censer, incense filling the air with choking smoke. The shapes of the children appeared within it, twisting, turning, reaching with tiny, impossible hands. The watchers could see the figures in multiple places at once, ghostly and solid simultaneously, advancing and retreating, laughing softly, echoing words no living mouth could produce. The wind shifted again, carrying a new sound, footsteps echoing from beyond the ridge. The watchers strained, lanterns lifting, but there was nothing visible. Yet the sound persisted, circling the graves, deliberate, patterned, growing closer. Harper realized with dawning horror that the voices were not confined to the graveyard. The Wither's children had expanded, learning the contours of the land, bending reality to their presence. "They move beyond the soil," Harper whispered to Briggs, voice trembling. "Every night, they grow stronger. They are no longer bound by the grave." A tremor shook the earth violently, and a coffin broke through the frost, toppling to one side. Something thin and pale pushed out, struggling to rise, then vanished into a swirl of frost and mist. The watchers scrambled, desperate, their prayers ineffective against the impossible. Lanterns flickered, shadows stretched and warped, and whispers threaded through the marrow of their bones. The Reverend's voice rose to a crescendo, chanting words lost to memory, calling upon saints and angels, invoking mercy and command, yet the frost continued to thrum, to pulse, to bend reality. The watchers felt an oppressive presence, aware, intelligent, patient. It did not strike or destroy, it simply waited, knowing that fear would eventually do the work for it. Time stretched. Hours passed, though they felt like days. The watcher's perception faltered. The frost seemed to rewrite the landscape with every blink. Shapes pressed at the boundaries of vision, retreating only when observed directly, then returning when ignored. The whispers layered upon themselves, recursive, insistent, echoing words half understood. We remember. We are patient. You will tire. We will rise. By dawn, the watchers were broken, trembling, eyes wide, unable to comprehend what they had seen. The frost had returned to a semblance of stillness, yet the soil beneath the graves bore impressions, deep, exact, the marks of tiny hands pressing upward once more. The coffins were disturbed, some cracked, stone slabs shifted, and the sense of intelligence behind the movement was undeniable. Reverend Cole met with the townsfolk, his face drawn and frost-bitten. The cycle continues. Each burial strengthens them. Each night teaches them patience. We cannot fight them as men. We are witnesses. We endure, or we join them. The chapter closes on a macro cliffhanger. As the watchers stagger from the frost-bound graves, the patterns in the soil form a perfect spiral, a symbol unknown to any living hand. From the spiral rises a single voice, carried on the wind, soft, cold, infinite. Soon, all will remember with us. The 6th night has ended. The Wither's children are no longer mere spirits. They are a persistent, intelligent, shaping force within the land, bending reality, awaiting the next burial to further cement their dominion. The town had become a husk of itself. Silence pressed against every wall, every street, heavier than frost or snow. The Wither's children were no longer a story whispered by candlelight. They were a law that governed the night, an invisible tribunal that tested courage, patience, and sanity. By the 7th burial, the townsfolk moved like shadows, their faces hollow, their actions mechanical, performing a ritual that had long since transcended reason. Reverend Cole prepared the coffins with meticulous care, tracing protective glyphs, chanting prayers older than memory, smearing sacred oils and whispering litanies that seemed to vibrate the very air. The frost around the graves shifted beneath his hands, curling into geometric patterns that mirrored the previous night's spiral. Each pattern was precise, deliberate, as if the children were guiding it themselves, leaving a mark that was not merely symbolic, but functional. Jonathan Harper, Henry Briggs, and the other watchers assembled with the kind of dread that had become second nature. They carried rifles, lanterns, and iron implements, though each man knew that their weapons were powerless against the impossibility beneath the frost. Their breaths steamed in the air, mingling with the incense from the reverend censer. They were aware that each breath carried the presence of something unseen, something patient, something waiting. The coffins were lowered, and immediately the frost responded. Crystalline fingers crept over the slabs, curling upward, shimmering in the lantern light. The earth beneath trembled, subtly at first, then violently, as though testing the weight of the watcher's will against the persistence of the buried children. A low, wet groan emanated from the soil, resonating through bones, through marrow, threading into the mind like an invasive whisper. "They test us," Harper murmured, voice tight. "They are learning the limitations of fear and the endurance of men." The frost cracked, spreading like a web. Shapes formed within it, thin, pale, vaguely humanoid, flickering in and out of visibility. Each shimmer carried intent, a deliberate intelligence that observed the watcher's every move. One shape, smaller than a child yet impossibly thin, pressed its face against the frost, staring through it, its eyes black voids that seemed to pierce memory itself. The Reverend swung his censer, chanting louder, invoking saints, angels, the mercy of the Almighty, yet the frost continued to shift and thrum. The watchers' rifles fired into the crystalline wall, bullets dissolving into mist, striking nothing. The shapes multiplied, not in number, but in presence, bending the perception of space and time. Shadows overlapped again, forming impossible geometries, and the whispers layered in recursive patterns that drilled into cognition itself. "Do you see?" Briggs whispered, voice barely audible over the wind. "Do you see what waits when the earth remembers?" Suddenly, the earth erupted. Not fully, but in part. Stones shifted, coffin lids splintered, and the frost coiled upward as though writhing in anticipation. Tiny hands pressed against the frost and soil, the impressions deep and deliberate. One of the watchers fainted at the sight. Harper gritted his teeth, forcing himself to remain upright. The Reverend's voice broke, yet he continued to chant, each word a desperate hammer against the impossible presence that pressed against the reality of the town. From the shadows, a voice, singular yet omnipresent, reverberated in the watchers' minds. "The cycle nears its end, and we remember everything." It was a whisper and a command, a melody and a warning. The frost thickened, forming towering shards that leaned inward, encasing the watchers in a crystalline cage. Shapes pressed closer, twisting and elongating, faces forming and dissolving in impossible geometry. The watchers' lanterns flickered violently, casting shadows that moved independently of the men. Each breath carried the sensation of invisible hands brushing against their faces, of cold fingers pressing on their skulls, threading through thought. Harper realized then what the Reverend had been hinting all along. This was no longer about burial. This was a test of endurance, of perception, of humanity itself. The children, or whatever they had become, were shaping the frost, shaping the earth, shaping the minds of those who observed. Their memory was a tool, their patience a weapon, and the watchers were the subjects of an experiment older than the town itself. The frost shifted again, forming a perfect spiral around the seventh grave. From its center, a figure rose, small, pale, humanoid, but with features twisted into an expression of infinite patience. Its eyes, black and deep, locked onto Harper. The air around them vibrated, a low hum threading into bones and blood, carrying with it the weight of eternity. The watchers felt a pull, an urge to kneel, to obey, to acknowledge dominion, but they resisted, trembling, teeth clenched. The Reverend knelt, hands shaking over his rosary. His voice rose in a final crescendo, invoking names lost to memory, appealing to mercy, to law, to the very universe itself. The frost responded, not violently, not with malice, but with understanding. The spiral pattern shifted, contracting slightly, the shards leaning inward, but the figure remained, patient, observing, waiting. Witness. Endure. Remember. The whisper came again, echoing in every mind present. And then silence. Complete, unnatural silence. The frost ceased moving, the soil stilled, the wind dropped. Lanterns burned steadily. The watchers exhaled in unison, shaking, eyes wide, but the sense of presence did not fade. The children had not gone. They had merely paused, their patience eternal, their memory intact. By dawn, the town had become aware of a truth too heavy to bear. The Withers children were no longer bound to coffins, to graves, or to stone. Each burial had strengthened them, sharpened their patience, and expanded their reach. The cycle was nearing its conclusion, and with the 8th burial approaching, the watchers understood that no ordinary measure, prayer, ritual, or physical restraint, would contain what had learned to bend the earth, the frost, and the minds of men. The chapter closes on a macro cliffhanger. As Harper and Briggs stagger from the frost-bound graves, Harper notices the frost beginning to shimmer in patterns that are unmistakably letters, an inscription, a message meant to be read, or perhaps a warning. It glows faintly in the pre-dawn light, spelling words that chill the soul. Soon, all will remember. The penultimate ritual has passed, but the Withers children have grown beyond comprehension. They are no longer merely spirits. They are memory, patience, intelligence, and frost-bound force, waiting to complete the cycle in the final burial. The air was brittle, a frozen silence that seemed to weigh on the chest like stone. The eighth burial had become a procession of inevitability. The town no longer argued or prayed with hope. They obeyed, moving in mechanical cadence behind the Reverend and his trembling censer. Each step toward the ridge where the graves lay was a step deeper into dread, a measured approach toward a reality that no human mind was meant to comprehend. Reverend Cole had prepared the coffins with meticulous care, tracing glyphs with sacred oil, carving wards into the wood, and chanting prayers older than memory itself. The frost had thickened into walls of translucent crystal, sharp as blades, curling around the graves as if to protect or to warn. Shapes moved within it, small, pale, humanoid forms, pressing, writhing, and shifting, always observed yet never fully seen. The watchers felt their gaze and their presence pressed against the skin, cold and patient, demanding recognition. Jonathan Harper and Henry Briggs, the two survivors of previous vigils, led the watchers this night. They carried rifles, iron implements, and lanterns, but their minds were burdened with the knowledge that no weapon could pierce what existed in the frost, in the soil, in the spaces between thought. Each breath carried the scent of decay and memory, threading into the marrow and lungs, and the snow beneath their boots seemed alive, bending to the rhythm of the children's awareness. As the coffins were lowered into the frost-hardened soil, the wind shifted. It was no longer the whispering gust of a winter storm. It carried voices, layered, recursive, threading through thought with surgical precision. The watchers realized that these voices were not simply echoes. They were commands, tests, questions, probing the boundaries of endurance and sanity. "You will see. You will endure. You will remember," Harper whispered to Briggs, voice trembling. "Every burial has taught them patience, and now they are ready." The frost moved. Crystalline fingers curled upward from the earth, tracing geometric patterns that mirrored the spirals of previous nights, yet now more intricate, more deliberate. Small, pale hands broke the frozen soil, pressing against the coffins, leaving impressions that were impossibly deep, as though the children were testing the physical limits of matter itself. Shapes formed and dissolved in the lantern light, twisting in impossible angles, bending perception, bending the watcher's very understanding of reality. The Reverend raised his censer, chanting louder than any human voice should carry. Smoke spiraled upward, forming faint, ephemeral shapes, faces, hands, torsos, that twisted and warped as though the children were observing, judging, learning from the rites themselves. Each motion of the censer seemed to provoke the frost to respond, shifting in intricate, unnatural patterns that trapped the watchers in a cage of crystalline geometry. A sudden tremor shook the earth violently. Coffin lids cracked, stones shifted, and small, translucent forms emerged from the frost. They moved with deliberate intelligence, pressing forward, observing, measuring, their black, featureless eyes fixed on Harper and Briggs, and the watchers felt the weight of eternity pressing down through the soil, through the frost, into their minds. "They are no longer children," Briggs whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "They are something else, something older. We are not burying them. We are feeding them." The frost thickened into walls, crystalline and jagged, encasing the watchers in a prison of impossible geometry. Shapes pressed against these walls, faces forming in angles that should not exist, their voices threading through thought like needles. The watchers' lanterns flickered violently, throwing shadows that twisted independently of their owners. Harper realized that time had become malleable. Seconds stretched and contracted unpredictably, echoing the rhythm of the whispers. Reverend Cole, exhausted beyond measure, fell to his knees in the snow. He raised his voice in a final, desperate crescendo, invoking saints, angels, and the Almighty itself. The frost responded, not violently but with subtle acknowledgement. The shards leaned inward, the spiral patterns contracting, but the figures remained. They were patient, eternal, aware, and unyielding. From the center of the eighth grave, a single figure rose, a small, pale form, humanoid, yet impossibly thin, black voids where eyes should have been. It observed the watchers with intelligence, its presence pressing against the very fabric of reality. The frost pulsed in response to its will, bending the landscape, twisting perception. Soon, all will remember with us, the voice whispered, omnipresent, threading through the watchers' bones and blood. The watchers tried to retreat, but the frost shifted beneath their feet, guiding them toward the center of the spiral. Lanterns swung, rifles fired, prayers shouted, but the figures moved with calculated patience, dissolving into mist when approached, reforming elsewhere, shaping the space to their intent. Harper and Briggs realized that this was no longer a burial. It was the awakening, the culmination of the Withers children's persistence, memory, and power. By dawn, the watchers were shattered, trembling, minds frayed, bodies frostbitten. The eighth burial had been completed, yet the children did not rest. The frost around the graves shimmered, forming intricate patterns of impossible geometry. From within the spiral rose a voice, singular, omnipresent, and patient. We remember, and soon, all will remember with us. The chapter closes on a macro cliffhanger. The watchers and townsfolk understand that the Withers children have grown beyond burial, beyond earth, beyond the frost. They are memory, will, and intelligence, a shaping force that defies comprehension. The final chapter approaches, and the ultimate confrontation, if such a thing is possible, awaits. The air was a frozen silence, thicker than ice, heavier than snow. The town had become a husk, its streets abandoned, doors bolted, windows shuttered. Even, the wind seemed hesitant, holding its breath against the weight of what awaited at the ridge. Jonathan Harper, Henry Briggs, and the Reverend Cole ascended once more, their lanterns shaking in frostbitten hands. They carried the last coffins, the ninth and final burial, knowing this was no longer an act of faith or duty, but a confrontation with a force beyond comprehension. Reverend Cole prepared the coffins meticulously, tracing glyphs with sacred oil, smearing protective powders, chanting prayers older than memory, older than the town itself. The frost around the graves shimmered in anticipation, curling into spirals and geometric shapes that seemed to breathe, alive with intelligence. Shapes moved within the ice, pale, thin humanoid forms, their black, void-like eyes fixed on the watchers, pressing against the frost with a patience that no human could endure. "It will be the last," Cole whispered, voice trembling yet resolute. "After this, we shall see what remains." The watchers lowered the coffins into the frozen earth. The wind shifted, carrying layered whispers that threaded through thought, memory, and bone. Each breath felt heavy, as if inhaling frost, soil, and the memory of the Withers children themselves. Shapes pressed against the coffins, hands pushing, faces forming and dissolving, twisting and elongating, observing, measuring, learning. The frost thickened rapidly, forming walls around the graves and watchers alike. Lanterns flickered violently, casting shadows that moved independently, overlapping, converging, impossible. Time became malleable, seconds stretched, contracted, folding into themselves. The watchers felt their minds unraveling, pulled between memory and perception, past and present, dream and reality. "We have endured. We have witnessed," Harper whispered, voice breaking. "Now we see." A tremor ran through the earth, and the frost pulsed. From the center of the spiral, a figure emerged, thin, pale, humanoid, with eyes like voids. It moved with deliberate intelligence, observing, testing, calculating. Then another rose, then another, until dozens, hundreds of translucent forms pressed against the frost, filling the spiral with patient, silent menace. Each form echoed the last, overlapping, multiplying, yet distinct, a congregation of memory and persistence. The Reverend raised his censer one final time, chanting with every ounce of strength. Smoke twisted into shapes, faces, torsos, hands, that reached for the Watchers, only to vanish into the frozen air. The Watchers fired their rifles, striking nothing, bullets dissolving into mist. Their prayers shattered against the weight of presence, failing to contain, failing to repel, failing to comprehend. Witness, endure, remember. The omnipresent whisper echoed through their minds, threading through bone, marrow, and memory. The Watchers tried to flee, but the frost beneath their boots shifted, guiding them toward the center of the spiral. The figures pressed closer, dissolving into mist when approached, reforming elsewhere, shaping the space to their intent. Harper and Briggs understood with a clarity that chilled the marrow. The Wither's children were no longer bound by earth or coffin. They were memory, intelligence, patience, and will made manifest, shaping reality itself. Suddenly, the frost cracked along the spiral's edges, shards falling away to reveal the coffins beneath. The earth shifted violently, and the figures coalesced around the graves, their black eyes fixed on the Watchers. They were aware, patient, eternal, and unstoppable. Shapes pressed through the frost, emerging fully from the soil for the first time, pale, distorted, humanoid, and impossibly thin. They moved in synchronized patterns, weaving among each other, forming impossible geometries that bent perception, defying physics, bending space, and time itself. "They are complete," Briggs whispered, voice quivering. "All the burials, all the rituals, they've become whole." The Reverend's voice rose in a final crescendo, calling upon saints, angels, and the Almighty itself. The frost responded, not violently, but with acknowledgement. The figures paused, their patience unbroken, their intelligence calculating. They observed, waiting, knowing that the Watchers had reached the end of endurance. The air pulsed with their presence, the whispers threading through thought, memory, and marrow. Harper's eyes darted across the spiral. The frost formed letters, words, symbols impossible to interpret fully. And then he understood. This was not a burial. This was an awakening. The Wither's children had grown beyond mortal constraints. They had learned patience, memory, and persistence, bending frost, soil, and thought alike. They were no longer bound to the town. They were bound to memory itself, and all who had witnessed would carry their presence forever. From the spiral, a single voice emerged, singular and omnipresent, threading through every mind present. "We remember, and soon all will remember with us." The Watchers could not resist. The figures pressed closer, the frost shimmering with impossible intelligence. Shapes merged and multiplied, overlapping, forming a congregation of memory, will, and intelligence. Harper and Briggs fell to their knees, unable to flee, unable to resist, trapped by the weight of inevitability. Reverend Cole sank to the frozen ground, voice broken, chanting fragments of litanies that could no longer hold power. The frost began to crumble, dissolving into mist that carried the whispers far beyond the ridge, into the town, into homes, threading through the air, through memory, through anyone who had borne witness. The Wither's children were no longer confined. They had become a force beyond comprehension, spreading awareness, memory, and patient intelligence into the very fabric of reality. The final image lingered, translucent, thin figures, eyes black, voids, forming a spiral that stretched into the horizon, coalescing memory and will, patient and eternal. Harper, Briggs, and Cole understood. The cycle was complete. The town would endure physically, but mentally and spiritually, all would carry the weight of what had awakened. The Wither's children were now everywhere and nowhere, a persistent presence of memory, patience, and frostbound will. "All will remember," the omnipresent voice whispered, fading with the last shimmer of frost. leaving a silence so heavy it pressed against the mind, against the chest, against reality itself. The cycle was complete. The Wither's children had transcended burial, earth, and coffin. They were memory, presence, intelligence, and will. The Watchers were witnesses, forever changed, forever haunted. And in the wind that carried the last whisper across the ridge, the truth became clear. Some horrors do not end. They only evolve, waiting patiently, eternally, until memory itself is bound to them.